first experience with opera was when I was, I think I was like 7 or 8 years old, okay? My best friend who lived around the corner from me, his name was Peter Ransman. And I tell you that because when he grew up, Peter became an opera agent, right? And I became an opera composer, essentially. But we would go to each other's piano lessons. And I went to his piano lesson one day with Mrs. Fox. And while he was playing, I pulled a book out of the shelf. And I remember the experience as sort of mythological, like as if there was light behind the book. Because it was this book called The Victor Book of Opera. And I was mesmerized by it. And when Peter was done with his lesson, Mrs. Fox saw the way I was looking at this book, and she gave me the book. And the thing about it was, I was instantly obsessed. And then I made Peter become obsessed. So we started going to the opera at like 9 and 10 years old. That's a good question. First of all, a lot of the stories I've told, including like Orpheus and Eurydice, Green Sneakers, a lot of those pieces, Sycamore Trees, they're pieces where I was working something out through the stories I was telling. Sometimes you're asked to do stories, for example, The Grapes of Wrath, or A Coffin in Egypt, that I'm doing for Houston Grand Opera this year, where you first, before you say yes, you have to live with the story and see if you're going to be able to speak through it. Do you know what I mean? Yes. And for me, by speaking through it, it means personalizing it. And Orpheus and Eurydice is a really sort of freakish example because that was a case where I had a story I needed to tell, and suddenly the myth arose within me. And because, in a way, I was at the advantage of knowing the general story of the myth without all the details. You know what I mean? I was able to just co-opt it and turn it into my own story as I needed it. It's funny because I always think about this, Robert Lowell was asked why he wrote poetry. And he said to break people's hearts. And there's something true in that when you tell a story, especially something like Orpheus and Eurydice, where you're saying, this is what happened to me, right? I was moved to write this because this is my story. You hope that people will be both moved and ennobled within their own stories. Whatever story they bring to Orpheus and Eurydice, if they can leave feeling like, for example, they loved, they lost, but they were richer in the end. It's worth it to tell your own story, even the perils of telling the truth about yourself are worth it when you see other people both moved and ennobled by someone taking the risk of telling their story. Actually, I thought that idea was a great idea. It wasn't until there was a moment during rehearsal in Long Beach because we couldn't rehearse till rather late at night because the pool was an active pool, so people were swimming. And Long Beach was sort of a slightly cold, damp place. So at night, it would be a little bit cold, a little bit damp, and late, and you'd be at this pool. And it just seemed like such chaos. And I remember at one point, Elizabeth Butrell and I just looking at each other and going, like, what have we gotten ourselves into? And this is where Andreas, what I really admire about him, a lot of times you just couldn't tell what was happening. It felt like this person was swimming there, that person was walking here, they were playing with lights, they couldn't even have a set until, it was like the set had to be put up and taken down. And so you had no sense of it. Then when it started coming together and you thought like, wow, Andreas is one of those weird, patient people. They see something in their head and they're fine about creating a mess and sort of knowing that nobody knows what it's going to be and everybody's looking at them thinking, what the, And then it came together, and it was staggering. Ultimately, no matter what information is there, including the writer who writes the words, if it's not me, the singers whose voices you hear in your head, the players, it's still a private experience. You still have to come up with something from inside of you to create for them. No matter what limitations, no matter what the parameters are, it is still a private thing where something happens inside of you and dresses the proceedings. Are we, Jake and I writing for baritones and sort of expanding the baritone repertoire? Well, maybe we're living in a great age of baritones. We're living in a great age of baritones and lyric mezzos. Do you know what I mean? So we're sort of expanding that repertoire. It doesn't feel quite like anything, and I'll tell you why. Because if you are a composer, you know that you are revered, you are reviled. Do you know what I mean? There are critics who think you're wonderful. There are critics who think you're awful. And you're never really in a position to just be lauded and adored. So there is more an inner flame that your job or my job is to make sure that inner flame flickers steadily and keeps me doing my work. There's no way for the barometer to go too high or too low because there's always someone there to tell you, and usually in a very public way, that you stink. What's important to me is that my impulse to do it in the first place stays alive.